that his words would be your words, O God, your words of truth, your words of freedom, your words of power, and your words that pierce our hearts, O God. Lord, have your way amongst us this morning, right now. And Lord, convict us where we've gone wrong, encourage us where we've gone right, that we may walk in the eyes of our Heavenly Father in your truth and justice, in the ways and will you have for us, O God. Lord, cleanse our hearts, renew our land, and make us holy unto you. We ask this today. In Jesus' name. Amen.
You guys hear me? Yeah. It's every Sunday struggle, isn't it? This microphone, some stuff too loud. God is good all the time. That was a great song. And a great reminder, especially for what we've been talking about on Sunday. But God is good all the time. Excuse me. So we have been in the book of James. And it has just been really refreshing to me to see what the Lord, just through his word, what the Lord is doing, what he is saying, and just, what I love about expository preaching, I'm going through a book of the Bible, is that sometimes God just makes you talk about things that you typically would not talk about throughout the year. And that's just why I love his word. It truly is living. And God just has so much in store for us if we just spend time in his word. And I love topical preaching. I do it all the time. But man, I'm just so happy to go through this book that's just been so great for me, and I hope it's been great for you. So we're going to finish it. We're going to continue in it until we finish it. Amen? Amen. Amen. So last week we began our study through the book of James. Now James is a great book for us to use as we enter this new year with a zeal to please God, a zeal to please Christ with our lives, and just to live out the mission statement here at Highland. This book is perfect for that if we are truly wanting to do that. You know, as Christians, we just face so many struggles like persecution, and then there's the personal struggles like doubt, individual doubt that we may have, sin in our lives, conflict with our brothers and sisters, conflict with our neighbors. The book of James deals with all of that. And I think what else is great about James is written by the brother of Jesus Christ. It's written by someone who was an unbeliever for much of Jesus' ministry on earth. And it is written by someone who became a believer, seen Christ, the risen Christ. And then someone who becomes a pillar in the New Testament church and went through the persecution that we read about all the time. And then this book is written by someone who died for the beliefs of the gospel. So this is a great, great book, I think, today for us. And so last week we saw that humanity and trials, they just go hand in hand in a broken world. If you're human, you're going to go through trials because we live in this fallen world and we have been corrupted by sin. But Christians have the privilege and the power to respond to trials with joy because we understand the trials. They strengthen our faith and they draw us into this just deeper, intimate relationship with our Creator. So we can respond in joy because trials are opportunities to shape us and mold us into the image of Christ. Now, to the natural man and woman, to the unbeliever, that makes no sense what I'm saying. But to the Christian, we understand that is the path to greatness. And not the world's idea of greatness, but what God says greatness is. And what God says greatness is Jesus Christ. So trials put us on the path to become like Jesus Christ. Put us on the path to greatness. And as Spurgeon said last week, I've just been thinking about this quote. He said, "We learn to kiss the wave that throws us against the rock of ages." So what Spurgeon is saying is that when we see a trial, we'll get to a place in our Christian walk that we love trials because we know they're going to make us more like Christ. I was talking to my friend this morning. I was like, Spurgeon has a lot of quotes. There's a lot of stories about Spurgeon. I hope they're all true. Because, you know, I mean, there's just so many great stories about Spurgeon. I could just go on and on and on about some of these really great quotes. But that was a joke, and you missed it, but that's your fault. So, all right, we'll keep going. I thought it was funny. If you're one of the thousands of people who join a gym as part of your New Year's resolutions, you are going to hear, or if you haven't heard already, the battle is in your mind, or the mind is half the battle. The idea is that the right attitude would assist you towards your goals. So James, and it's a good point, you know, the mind is half the battle, and also half the battle is market basket. But the point is, the mind is half the battle. But James starts his letters to the Jews dispersed because of persecution, that the right attitude towards trials will lead to joy, maturity, rewards, and strong faith. And so today we will see that the wrong attitude towards trials can lead to destruction in the lives of Christians. So ultimately what I want you to see is that we must have a proper understanding of how God works in the lives of his people. Because when we don't, I think that's where a lot of our misconceptions about life spring from that as Christians, because we do not understand how God works in the lives of his people. So let us read James 1, 13 through 18. I'll pray and then we'll get started. James 1, verse 13. We're going to go to 18. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. Verse 18, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for the book of James. And I just thank you for preserving your word, and even going further, just for even revealing your word to us. And Lord, I just pray that you would shape us and mold us into who you would have for us by the time we get through this book in March, and when we look back at where we are then, we'll just glorify you and thank you for what we've learned. And I also just pray, Lord, if there's anyone here that is just truly dealing with temptations, but that they will find some type of joy, some type of hope, and also gain some tools to deal with temptations that they may be facing, that we all are facing, Lord. So I just thank you that you even included this here for us, that we can grow closer to you. Also, Lord, just be with our teachers who are teaching right now downstairs, Father. Open the hearts of the young ones, the little ones, Lord, that they would understand and grab on to what is important. And I just pray that in the future, Lord, that this building will be filled with the young ones who started downstairs and then moved upstairs, and it'll be a continual process until Christ returns. I ask all these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. James has always been a refreshing book to me because it's just so practical. And typically when you meet anyone, a younger, especially college students who are Christians, they love the book of James because it really just says the things that we're feeling, and it just calls you into practice. So I typically do not meet anyone who do not like the book of James. But my struggle with James when I got saved was I felt he was just all over the place with so many topics in weird places. For instance, so far he's been talking about trials for verses 1 through 12. And then verse 13, the topic is now temptations. So as a new Christian, that was very frustrating because, I didn't lose any sleep over it, but it was still just like, okay, now we're talking about temptations. I thought we were talking about trials. I couldn't connect the two. But now that I'm older, and we talked about this last week, I've been through some things, I've lived a little bit, I can see how the two go together, how trials and temptations go together. Our flesh, this body, is always looking for an opportunity to sin. Always. It's always looking for an opportunity to sin. So our flesh will use any opportunity to pursue sin, even our trials. Galatians 5:17 says, for the flesh sets its desire against the spirit. So the flesh on its own, it will not push us towards holiness. It will never push us towards just thankfulness and righteousness towards honoring God. So what James is saying here is that even our trials carry with them temptations to sin. So let me give you a quick definition of temptations. To tempt means to entice to improper behavior. So temptations desire to bring about sinful actions. So the word translated for trials is actually the same word used for temptations here. So the word could mean external trials that we face daily, and it can also mean inner enticement to sin. So we all have different trials we're facing, but we also have different temptations we're facing. My temptations are not the same as your temptations. We all have different sin issues. And most of the time, if we're honest, we're losing that fight. And it can be very frustrating when you want to stop a certain behavior that is displeasing to God, yet you are just so drawn to it. So everywhere you go, you are constantly being tempted to engage in that sinful behavior. And what happens is we start to say things like, oh, why won't God just take this away? Or why is God tempting me to do evil? So how do we overcome temptation? We must understand the source of temptation. So if you're taking notes, and you should take notes because I just found this out, humans forget an average of 50% of what they learn within 1 hour. And in a week, 90% of what they have learned. So add 50 to that if you're a male. Right? Well, ladies, but anyway, you guys are missing all of these great jokes. You're missing all of them. I worked on this stuff all night. All right. That's true. We do forget a lot of stuff. I know I do. So what I've done is I've broken this passage into 2 sections, if you're taking notes. So the first section is what God isn't doing, and then the second section is what God is doing. So what isn't God doing, and what God is doing. Yes, I know that sounds horrible, but that's just how we're going to do it today. All right, so 2 sections, and then we'll do application after that, which will be, do not be deceived. Starting with what God isn't doing. Right in the text, as soon as the text, James lets us know straight up, he says, God is not tempting us with sin. He says, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. So, number 1, God is not tempting us with sin. Maybe you have found yourself in a situation where you are enticed by sin and you think, maybe God is testing me right now. And you may walk away from that temptation successful, but most of the time you fail. And then you become angry with God. God, why are you testing me? Or you develop this nonchalant attitude about saying, God was testing me, and I failed this time, and I'll do better next time. James is saying that when we feel enticed to sin, do not blame God as if he is tempting you to sin as a test of some sort, because God is not tempted by sin, and God does not use sin to tempt us. So does God test us? Well, yes. The Old Testament shows us examples of God testing us. You know, God tested Abraham when he ordered him to sacrifice his son in Genesis 22:1. And God tested Israel by leaving them surrounded by other nations to see if they would walk in his way or not. And that's in Judges. That's in the book of Judges. I didn't write down the verse, but one of the purposes of leaving Israel and the nations surrounding him, God is saying, I want to see what they're going to do. I want to see if they're going to follow me or they're going to follow the other nations. That is a test. And God may test us because he wants to strengthen our faith, but he never provokes his children to sin and destroy their faith, because that would be working against himself. It says, for God cannot be tempted by evil, then he himself does not tempt anyone. So when I was in Bible college, my professor put me and a friend in the front of the room, and he asked me and my friend, could Jesus have sinned? while on earth? And my response to that was, and I thought I had a pretty good case, was yes. I thought. And the reason I thought that is because of Hebrews 4:15. It says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things, as we are, yet without sin." But my professor told me I really should think about the implications that come with my belief. So let's do that real quick together. You see, sin is a trespass of God's law. So God's law has to do a lot with his character and his nature. For God to sin, he would have to act out of his very own nature. 2 Timothy 2:13 says, "If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself." The Bible overwhelmingly tells us that Jesus is God. In fact, in Colossians 2:9, "For in him the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form." So if Jesus could sin, what you're saying is that God could sin. And we see that is not true. So we must change how we look at Hebrews 4:15. Jesus was presented with the same temptations like us, yet he remained sinless because he is God. Theologians will call this impeccability versus peccability. And, Jesus could not have sinned because he isn't capable of sinning. That is impeccability. Now, why is this amazing, and why should we be rejoicing? Is this something that we should just debate over? Is this something that fills our head with just knowledge? This is amazing because many of us are tempted daily. And some of us may be tempted now. You're probably struggling between listening to me and contemplating sin. Maybe when you leave here at home, there is temptation waiting for you. Our hope is that Jesus Christ is divine and human. He understood our struggles, and his human side died for those sins, but he is also divine. He is eternally, infinitely holy. So his death could pay for our sins because he is holy. And the power that beats death also rose him from the dead, and it lives in each of us, in every one of us. We can take hold of that power when we are tempted. That's why it is good news. God may allow temptations, but he is not the author of them. In fact, he sovereignly protects you from certain temptations. Look at 1 Corinthians 10:13 right here. It says, "No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it." So when we are tempted to sin, we must understand that it is not from God. If God is to use sin to grow our faith, he would deny himself, and it wouldn't grow our faith. So we must know what is the source of temptations. Just like if we were in a battle, we need to sit down and process where the enemy is, where they're coming from, and what tools are the enemy using. So if you're still keeping notes, the source of temptation, verses 14 through 15. "But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death." So James is telling us that our temptations, they come from within. The source of our temptations are ourselves. Some translations may say, dragged away by evil desires, or you're drawn away by evil desires. So James truly believed that we had a sinful nature. We'll see in a couple of days in chapter 4. James says, "What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you?" He's talking about Christian brothers and sisters. And he says, "Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members?" That word pleasures is also the desires that we see here. So James believes that there is a source of sin that comes from just who we are. Just these worldly desires will always be there. And from those worldly desires spring temptations. Jesus says in Mark 7:20 through 23, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. So we have this indwelling sin nature, and from that spring temptations, and we are forcefully dragged and attracted to whatever we are tempted by. So if you fish like Pastor John, who was here just recently, you can relate because you do the same thing to fish. You bait them with something, you bait fish with something that will catch their eye. And the hook entices the fish, and the hook drags them away. Douglas Moo, he does a commentary on James, he says, if the supernatural attractiveness of desire is not resisted, a person can become hooked on it, unable to escape from its powerful lure. So if we continue to let temptations just be there and not do anything about them, it's going to happen when you grab onto it. You're going to become hooked to it, and then what happens is you'll be unable to escape from its power. So when you're being tempted or you're enticed by someone, something, or our own sinful nature, that in itself is not a sin. And we know this because Jesus was presented the same temptations as us. You know, the devil tempted him with lust of the flesh, and that was the bread, and the devil tempted him with the lust of the eyes, all the kingdoms of the world, and the pride of life. But basically, Jesus turned from those. Jesus wasn't, we know this, we all agree with this, that he was not sinful, he did not sin, but just because he was enticed, or just because Satan offered those things to him, that doesn't mean he was sinful. So temptations in themselves are not sinful, but temptations become sin when in our minds we are actively participating in the sinful act. And James illustrates this process with the imagery of birth. The mother conceives, so the mother is lust, and gives birth to a child. The child is sin. And then the child, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. And I was just thinking about this as I was working on this. I have a friend, a couple of friends, begging them not to entertain certain sins, Christian friends, and typically getting the responses that I can handle it, or whatever the case may be. And those friends are in jail today. And they got comfortable with these temptations. And then they finally acted on them. And and what's crazy about these sins is they started acting on these sins, and these sins got boring, and then sin took them further than where they wanted to go, and landed them also in jail. We cannot play with sin, but we also cannot play with our temptations. And so when we have a temptation, we need to understand that it's not from God, and we need to understand we got to do something about it. It is not going to go away. It is going to keep riling up. So just to sum up, just to keep up, what is God not doing? God is not tempting us with sin. God is not the author of the temptation. The source is ourselves, our own lust. God cannot be tempted by sin. He's unable to be tempted by sin because it goes against who he is. His very essence. And because of this, God does not use sin to tempt us because he wants to strengthen our faith. He doesn't want to break it. So having the wrong attitude towards our trials and temptations is a symptom of not understanding how God works in the lives of his people. And I'll just give an example. There seems to be just this unwritten rule, or it's okay in our society, even with Christians, that if you commit a certain sin while you're in a trial, it's okay because you were in a trial. Maybe you've experienced that, maybe you have a friend, or maybe it's you. I was in this trial, so I did this. I was in this, things were going bad in my life, and that's why I acted in this way. And if you're a counselor would say, don't worry about it. You were going through some hard times, and it's okay. And so what James is saying to these Christians who are facing all these trials, because they're being persecuted, we worldly, we could understand if they broke some of the rules of God, if they did some things to survive. You got to survive when you're being killed by Romans, right? James is saying no. James is saying that even though you are in trials, understand God is going to use these trials to strengthen your faith. And then James says, and also, you may be tempted to do some things that you know is not right because you're in a trial. Don't do those things. God is not using this sin. God is not in this whatsoever. God hates sin. And that is what James is trying to say to them. I think he needs to also say it to us. You know, when you're hungry, you know, all these trials that we're coming through, you know, there's ways, and some of you guys know there's ways to do things. Tax season's coming up, you know, right? It's time to report our taxes. So James is saying, look, no matter what you're going through, do not be deceived by telling yourself it's okay to act on those behaviors that you may feel. Does that make sense? So that is what James is saying to them, and that's what he's also saying to us. God is not using these sins. It is not a test. It is your sinful nature that is causing you to think like that. So then what is God doing? The next section. If we know what God is not doing, what is God doing? God is, as I said, God is not tempting with sin. We must have the right attitude towards that. So we see in verses 17 through 18 what God is doing. It says, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. And in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. So James tells us that God is giving us perfect gifts and exercising his will in our lives. You see, God is unchangeable and unchanging, and he's the source of everything that is good. So when he says the Father of lights, James has this imagery that he's thinking about. God is the creator. So the creator of light and the creator of the universe. So the earth, it spins. And we have night and we have day, but not with God. God is the same forever. We know that we don't have a God who is changing, and we know that we have, and the reason we know this is because he sits outside of time. He operates from day to day the same. He's the beginning. He's the end. From eternity past to eternity future, he is the same. There's no need for God to change because he is perfect. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So what James is saying is temptations are not from God because God hates sin now and forever. But God is giving good and perfect gifts. All of God's gifts are beneficial for our lives. God is working for our good. God is exercising his will in our lives. And that's a good thing. And what James is trying to tell us is that God has allowed this trial to come in your life. So it must be a good thing. He's going to allow something great to happen from it, which is typically strengthening your faith. But God is never, he's forever the same. And he already has a will that he has for your life. And so he gives us two examples of this truth. The first one is, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures.